Rather interestingly, I decided the main reason to wear this jacket was because today's presentation might confuse you, and I felt like, okay, we'll just start with confusion, right? You don't know where things are going. And that's, typical of me anyway. You're used to that. Also, I should say that John and I have already been in communication about next year's program. So in case you need a teaser, it is likely that next year we're going to have 4 sessions on God, God's anatomy, God's emotional life, God's, in the Hebrew Bible, because that's a large part of the piece of my next book is about God's emotional and, don't get shocked too fast, God's sexual life. So that's the title of that next book, actually, which is the kind of thing that annoys people sometimes about me. Like, does she have to be that clickbaity? Yeah, I do. Because I want you to read things and take things and have fun with things. Have fun with things. So, all right, all that said, gender complexity in the story of Joseph. I'm going to start with a quick review, like what is a queer narrative, right? I actually would say that my particular field of expertise is masculinity studies, but I have benefited enormously from the people who work in queer studies. They inform me all the time, as do feminist scholars, because man, am I rooted in feminist scholarship. Absolutely, that was my first love. So it's important for me to say for the next 3 weeks that we are not looking at homosexuality in the Hebrew Bible. There is no such thing in the Hebrew Bible. Homosexuality is a modern concept, and we don't find any evidence of what we would call homosexuality. There's evidence of different kinds of relationships, yes, but that's a different story. So when I'm talking about a narrative that is queer, I'm taking my line here from scholars like Ken Stone, who describe queer narratives as narratives that are unsettling. Something is queer and odd and unusual about the narrative. Something here is troubling our expectations of a binary world that is simply black and white, heaven and earth, carnal and spiritual, male and female, right? Which is how we have been taught in our world to divide the world into very simple binary oppositions. So something that troubles heteronormativity is a big piece of this, something that troubles even the basic binaries that we think of when we look at Bible. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at Joseph. I am so sorry, by the way. Everybody, just turn your head around once so that you can see that the actual PowerPoint is much more exciting in terms of its colors. Okay, you get the faded version there. Somebody said it's because I provide the drama, so there you are. So what do we know about Joseph? We do know he's a daddy's boy, and we do know he wears some unusual clothing. Now, this third piece is a little bit, as we would say in German, heikel. It's a little bit on the, can we say this for sure? Can we not? There's a word that's used of him when he's 17 years old, the word na'ar, which can mean a young soldier. It can mean a servant. It can also mean a younger boy. The scholars who point out that the na'ar here, that it's being used here in this context, Joseph's a full-grown adult, right? He's 17 years old, so why are we calling him a na'ar? And I would say this one is a borderline piece, because the word na'ar sometimes gets used for various kinds of roles that are not necessarily childlike. But still, I put it up there because it's an argument for us to be considering. His beauty is a topic. We're going to come back to that. In fact, we're going to come back to a number of the pieces here, right? So these are the things we all know. Now, is there anything else we know about Joseph that you want to throw into the mix, that you remember about Joseph, that you think would be important regarding Joseph's gender?
I was going to say, very aware that he's his father's favorite.
Oh, yes, very aware that he is his father's favorite. Absolutely. He is daddy's boy, and he knows it. Mm-hmm. When my son was a little guy, just the first year, my husband would come home from work in our 1970 station wagon Impala. And I would go out and say, Papa ist zu Hause, right? Because we only spoke German with Eric when he was little. And Eric, at the age of months, would reach out of my body. He'd be reaching for his father like this, like I thought I was gonna fall. And I used to call him my little Joseph, right? You're daddy's boy. Okay. So let's take a look at the clothes we wear. You all know about the many-colored cloak. That's usually how this is translated. He wore an ornamented tunic, and the actual phrase, we really want to emphasize this, is Israel loved Joseph best of all of his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he had made him this ornamented tunic. So the words that we're actually looking at here are ketonet pasim. And I just want to ask you, is there any other place in Bible where you think to yourself, oh, somebody is wearing something special? I remember that part of Bible. I'm not expecting that you would. But does anybody have any associations here?
The priest wore an ephod.
Say again?
The priest wore an ephod.
Yes, which is a very interesting. David wore one too. It's something like a linen apron, which, if you think about it, it was covering sort of the location that he also then displayed in his wild dance when he pretended to be both God's priest and God's king at the same time. That guy never suffered from an ego issue, did he? Like, wow. Okay, well, here's what I want to talk to you about. That's the next time, the only other time in all of Hebrew Bible that we find these words. Now, she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. This is Tamar, David's daughter. This particular verse comes after she has been raped by her half-brother Amnon, and you might remember what she does with this garment. Does anybody remember what she does? She rips it. She tears it, right? Which is the word there is kara, kriyat, is an act that Jews do at a funeral to this day. The intimate members of a family member who is lost tear a piece of their clothing over the heart, right, to show that their heart has been rended. It is an act of mourning. It is an act of grief. It is an act of sorrow. She rends this garment, and it is the only other place where we find these words, ketonet pasim. So Joseph wears a garment that appears to be understood and described as the garment that is made for young girls, for princesses, for virgin daughters. In both of these stories, the garment is described with the same words. That should make you go, huh? Did anybody go, huh? It's an interesting moment in this text. And actually, you could even make the argument that both of these figures, Joseph and Tamar, potentially, we know for certain that Tamar was the victim of a rape by her brother, her half-brother. So we know she is absolutely the victim of sexual violence. There is question, there is movement, there is space in the Hebrew Bible to ask, what actually did Joseph's brothers do to Joseph? Throwing him in that pit, right? Right? This is that space I talked about last week, right? The black fire and the white fire, like what's in between the lines, we would say in English. What's behind the story? What kind of abuse might have happened with Joseph, particularly because he seemed to have been wandering around in his beauty with a certain kind of behavior that was troubling for his brothers, right? So both characters certainly have brothers who abuse them. That much is true. And we could make the argument here that Joseph is not only wearing a garment made for young girls, but that he's at least for certain, transgressing some kind of norm, right? Men are not supposed to wear women's clothing, according to Hebrew Bible. Is that what he's doing? Yeah, question?
But his father made the coat for him.
Yes.
So did he know he was making a male garment for his? So repeat.
I will repeat that question because we're going to kind of we're going to circle back to this issue, right? It is Joseph's father who makes him this garment. So we have to ask ourselves, what was Jacob thinking, right? Why is Jacob making his son a garment that not only is going to get him an extraordinary amount of attention, but seems to have some kind of gender indeterminacy, some gender curiosity, some gender confusion associated with it at the very least, right? So let's hold this beautiful question, and we will come back to it later in this presentation. Because you did what I love when my students do this, when they kind of anticipate somehow where I'm going to go. How many teachers are in the room who know that moment? Yeah. Isn't that the greatest thing? Like they've started figuring it out. They don't even know that they're doing it, and they're doing it. Yeah, awesome. It's an awesome moment.
Everybody should turn around and look at how beautiful.
Oh, yes. Yes, if you want, take a look at how that looks, right? And I was really trying to capture with this picture, the fringes, the colors, Joseph standing out. I swear to God, we might next week just have to turn around, and I'll talk from back there. Maybe we can make that happen. I don't know. All right, so let's then go to this other thing that we know about Joseph, that he was well-built and handsome. His beauty is described. Now, he is not the only man to be described as beautiful in some way or another. Anybody raise your hands if you know another man who is described as beautiful in Hebrew Bible. Yes, ma'am. Okay, not in the Hebrew Bible. All right. Yes, ma'am. Saul is described as tall and, taller than all the other Israelites. I think I mentioned last year or the year before, he's in a kind of a beauty pageant. He stands right next to all the other Israelites, and he's the best looking of all of them. Yeah. Anybody else that you know is beautiful? Male? David, ruddy and bright-eyed. He actually is also in a beauty pageant. First Eliab walks down the aisle, his oldest brother. Then his next brother, and God goes, no, not that one. Not yeah, oh no, that young one who looks really cute, that's the one I want. And you might remember that David's two sons, Adoniah, I should probably pronounce that more properly. And then Absalom are both described as particularly beautiful. Absalom with amazing long hair that is so heavy that he has to cut it like every week. So it's not that beauty is never ascribed to men, right? I don't want to make that claim. But Joseph is the only character in the book of Genesis who is described as beautiful and handsome in this way. And what is interesting is that he's described as beautiful in appearance with the words, now you can listen to me say this and you'll hear the similarity, Yafet ar Yafeh Mareh. And his mother is described as Yafat Toar Vifat Mareh. So the only difference you heard there is that one of these words was masculine, and the other one was feminine, at, in ending, but it was the same word. Right? And so the very same words are used to describe shapely and beautiful, well-built and handsome. What happens if you put, now Joseph was shapely and beautiful. You see what the translators are doing here? They're using feminine associated language for Jacob's mother. They're using masculine associated language for Joseph. But the Hebrew is absolutely making no distinction whatsoever.
What is between coat and robe? The translators, again, for Joseph, we think of this as a coat of many colors.
That is right.
And Tamar wears a robe.
Yes.
What is the original Hebrew?
The Hebrew is exactly the same in both of these cases, too. So one of the biggest lessons of this week might be, traduttore e traduttore, which is translator is a traitor in Italian. And how many of you have ever translated? You know how much power you wield if you have translated to determine the meaning, the interpretation, and the consequences because of the choices you make. The extent to which our translators, Jewish and Christian, consistently are operating with binary assumptions about gender and using those to translate texts which otherwise will tell us a different story is absolutely shocking, right? This is the same language, which is why I really think we should switch it around and see how people react. Yes?
Interesting English problem that I've never thought of before. We talk about English not using gender except for pronouns. But will belt versus shapely, we use it all the time,
Yes.
but it's got a subtle level that's not as obvious.
That's right. We do not generally call a man pretty. We do call him handsome or good looking. Some of these words will translate for women, but we have gender associated language too. And it's happening in a major way here. Actually, I would honestly tell you that the gender-associated language is, for me, more pronounced in English than it is in Hebrew, where exactly the same words are used for both the male and the female.
What did the Septuagint do with that? Do you know?
I will go and look. I will go and look and see what the Septuagint does in the Greek. Now, I also have to be honest and say I have never studied Greek, so my ability to assess the Greek in there would be limited indeed. I'd have to rely on other translators, but it's worth looking at, yeah.
So
Yeah.
my guess is that later translators use the Septuagint more than they use the original Hebrew.
If they're Christian,
Christian.
yes. Christian translations almost always rely very, very heavily on the Septuagint, not on the text that I would rely on, which has the Hebrew. So your Christian translations are, and this might be a little bit unnerving for some of you, but you're already 2 times removed from the actual text, which means that all of these problems can get quite exacerbated. This is why, for example, most Christian translations in the particular text describe a young woman, just a young woman in the Hebrew, as a virgin who's going to give birth. I mean, there's no such thing in the Hebrew, which is why Jews will look at that same text and say, what are you talking about, right, in terms of virgins? It's not present. And these kinds of things do, end up having theological implications, of course. But they also have implications on, and I want to make a pitch here, this kind of thing has really terrifically powerful implications for children. And I cannot tell you how important that is, right? If you are already indoctrinating your children in boys are this and girls are that, and never is there any kind of indeterminacy, there's nothing in between this pole and that pole, you've indoctrinated your children in ways that are going to make life very hard for them on multiple levels, regardless of their particular gender affiliation and identity. So just putting that out there. So, right, what else do we have here? This is a moment from later in the story. Joseph hurries out. This is when his brothers come, and they don't yet know that he's Joseph, that he's the brother that they sold into slavery. And that piece, by the way, is another thing you might want to think about. What was he sold into? Slaves are often sold into sexual slavery, right? I mean, is that also a piece of Joseph's story that we don't appreciate? Excuse me for having a little thunder there. So he's overcome with feeling towards his brother, that's Benjamin. He's on the verge of tears. He goes into a room and he weeps there. And what we have here, ki nichmeru rachamav. Rachamav is the key word here. Rachamav is a motherly feeling. It means compassion, and it comes from the word rechem, which means the womb, right? And that's something for us to think about, right? Compassion comes from the womb. What is it already that the biblical authors are assuming here? What is the message that they're sending here about the source of compassion, right? That it comes from creating life, it comes from holding and containing and caring for life. You know, this is a very interesting kind of association, right? We say the word compassion, we don't immediately assume or think of women's wombs or a female body's wombs, right? Biologically. And why is that also important here? Because now we've had a couple of things happen, right? We've had Joseph wearing clothing that seems to be clothing for a young girl. We've had that. We know that he's that daddy's boy. And we now also have had a scene in which he is described as having rachamim. Now, this is actually a really important piece, and I want to give you a little more information about that. So, as the slide says, in the book of Genesis, this root, rechem, appears only 6 times. 3 are in the physical wombs of identified women, Leah, Rachel, and the women of Avimelech's household. All the other 3 are Joseph's. 6 times in the whole book of Genesis. 6 times. What else do we want to think about? When Jacob sends his sons, including Benjamin, to Egypt, he prays that the man, he doesn't know it's Joseph, the man that his sons have met before, have rachamim on them. So Joseph prays that the man have motherly feeling and compassion. Joseph, the father who made his son this female kind of cloak. So I want to get back to that earlier question that we had there, right? And in this discussion, in this passage in 43:30, we find Joseph's rachamim being activated upon seeing Benjamin, his younger brother, right? This reaction might be the very answer to his father's prayer, who prayed that the man have compassion. So Joseph sees his younger brother, the second son of his mother, right? The beautiful mother that is beautiful like he is beautiful. It's a really moving scene here. And finally, on Jacob's deathbed, he actually blesses Joseph with, as we have here, birchot shadayim v'racham, the blessings of breast and womb. He blesses Joseph with the blessings of breast and womb. Yes, this is the moment where I'm hoping you're going to go, huh? Yeah.
What does the typical translation say?
Well, the typical translation would be shadayim is breasts.
No, but in English.
Just as it's up here, breast and womb. This is, it's hard to translate this any other way. Shadayim is either breasts or mountains, and mountains doesn't make sense here. And the Hebrew rechem is coming here as racham. The vowels are a little bit different, but it's the same root, and it means womb. I mean, what are you going to do? Though I do think that it's possible, now that you ask, that if I looked at various translations, I might find the blessing of nurturing and compassion show up. See, this is where I got Jewish for a moment, and I didn't anticipate what a Christian translation might do with that. And I think they might do that. And some Jewish ones too, for that matter, you know? It could be. Okay, so we've got a lot of really interesting things going on with Joseph, and some of those interesting things are associated with his father's own behavior. And I want to ask, what are we meant to hear? The only other time that this phrase, this kind of phrase about his rachamim, right, shows up is in Kings. And I want you to see the way that this word is being used around particularly female-associated events, because this is one, again, we're in a royal chamber, we're this time in the court of King Solomon, we've got two women in a dispute, each has given birth, one of the babies has died, you know the story, its mother swapped it for the other living child, each accuses the other of this act, and then Solomon calls for a sword to cut the baby in two, and at that moment, the true mother has this surge of emotion, the same surge of emotion, the same surge of motherly feeling that Joseph had when he sees Benjamin. It's exactly the same wording. The only difference is that it's in feminine forms as opposed to masculine forms. That is the only difference. The actual language in these two passages, the only two passages where these appear, is exactly the same. And again, it's like Ketonet Pasim, right? It's only happening twice in a huge library of books, right? We got 24 books here of text, and this only shows up this way. And so we need to think again, you know, where are these words showing up? In what contexts are they showing up? Why is Joseph's beauty Rachel's beauty? Why is Joseph's compassion the same as the mother for her living child? So, reviewing, right? He has a feminine beauty like his mother. He wears a garment that princesses wear. He calls Benjamin my son and shows these maternal feelings. He's the only man in Genesis, to have rachamim. All the rest are all women. All the rest are all women. So now we get into some really interesting stuff, as if this hasn't been already interesting. So, giving birth and the role of the knees. Let's take those two passages, right? The one on the right is when effectively one of Jacob's wives says, no, you know, Rachel says, here, you are going to consort with Bilhah so that she may bear on my knees, and that through her I will have children. That she bear on my knees. All right, so just hold that image. We've also got a statement about Joseph. 2 children were born on Joseph's knees. All right, so I just want you to think really hard about this, because what seems to be going on here is something seriously physical with social and even perhaps legal consequences. We have evidence that in birthing postures of the ancient Near East, a laboring woman would lean back and brace against the body of another woman, an elder, while the midwife was positioned to catch the baby. Now, I'm not sure I'm remembering correctly. It's been many years since I read this book, but I believe in The Handmaid's Tale that that's how they do this with the handmaiden leaning against the adoptive mother's body. And if you think I'm making it up, there it is. See, the woman way in the back is holding the woman in the front, and the midwife is delivering the baby. And there appears, in this way, for this physical act to have legal repercussions about who that baby will go to. Sometimes we manage to get the physical evidence right in front of us of the textual description. So, where else do we have these kinds of ideas? Oopsie, I seem to be missing a slide here. All right, nope, this is just information I was going to give you verbally, apparently. Okay, so just some other examples. In Joseph's grand lament, he wonders why he was born, and he uses the phrase, why were there knees to push me out, right? So the knees come up there. In Isaiah 66:12, as part of a very lengthy prophecy on birth and infancy metaphors, there is, again, a kind of language. There's a promise that the people will suckle on the wealth of nations and be dandled on the knees. In Judges 16:19, Samson, whose own birth had been miraculous, falls asleep with his head on Delilah's knees while she cuts her hair. In 2 Kings 4:20, the Shunammite woman's son, whose birth had been prophesied, collapsed across her knees, the child, right, and dies. All of these instances of knees are references to the knees of women, with the possible exception of Joseph. Most of the references are connected to birth, right? And we saw that that was also the case of the example in 48:12, where Ephraim and Manasseh were born on Joseph's knees. So something here, right, like born on his knees to give to his father for a blessing in that text. Something about knees, women, birth keeps coming up in Hebrew Bible, and the only time we see it applied to a man is in this case where Ephraim and Manasseh were said to have been born on his knees. So let's take a look at our possibilities now. Here's the first one. This is a poem by an Israeli poet. For she has no son, and her prayers are numbered, and she must lie to her husband's sons she must lie even to God. Who do you think that poem is written about? Rachel. Rachel, she has no son. Leah has had 6 sons, right? She has no, well, some of them for Zilpah, but Leah's had all these sons, she has none. And so this Israeli poet imagines what would have happened if Rachel bore a daughter and had to lie and say to her husband that really the child was a son. What if that child was cross-dressed from the get-go? What if Jacob even knew somehow and was trying to ameliorate the situation by kind of giving his beautiful daughter, question mark, a way to feel beautiful, even though she had to act the role of the son? Something to just think about, right? Other possibilities. Was Joseph intersex? And is that why we see these rather odd kind of descriptions that seem to point to that? Was he born with ambiguous sexual traits of some kind or another? And, you know, these are biological realities that we have. An intersex condition that I might mention to you is congenital adrenal hypoplasia. And this is a situation when a child has 2 XX chromosomes and a uterus. But, you know, there can be some things that are like confusing, where you have a clitoris that looks more like a penis, and thus be assigned a male gender at birth, even though the child has these conditions. This is the kind of child who might grow up to have a mix of secondary characteristics, breasts and a beard, for example. So some of these conditions are often treated with medical interventions on children right away in order to deal with social problems, recognizing a child not belonging clearly to one part of the world or the other, male and female. But, you know, when we look at all this weird stuff about Joseph, we have to ask ourselves, you know, is there something that might have been going on here that we were not aware of? The Talmud repeatedly takes up the status of what is called an androgyne. An androgyne. It's one of the various kinds of discussions about human anatomy and sexual anatomy. So do we know that people were known not to land either in the definably female or the definably male condition? We do, absolutely we do. And do we know that this was part of ancient world and ancient existence? We know that too, right? So in a later program, I'm going to show you some pictures of some of these individuals that we have from various statues of the ancient Near East. So it's something for us to think about. And another thing that I want to mention, this is, I should have gone to this right away here, that estimates suggest that 1 to 2 people in 100 are born with intersex features. That's a whole lot more than we might have imagined, right? So another question is, did we have here a woman who was effectively, are we talking about a transgender situation, right? Whereas, I don't like this language much, born into the wrong body, because I think that might make it too easy for us to say, oh, see, and then when you have surgery, then you have the right body, right? Like, bodies are very liquid things. But is that a possibility, right? Was Joseph just transgender? And that accounts for these various kinds of texts that seem so unusual for us. This is a text written by Rabbi Erwin Keller. I am glad of an ambiguous Joseph, a Joseph who doesn't fit in the binary and who is beyond the binary, a Joseph whose existence is an invitation for all sorts of queer people to see themselves reflected in Torah's study, which too often are not fertile soil for our queer imagination. So, right, if we had had a translation where Joseph was beautiful, right, like his mother, like, would there have been children who belong to the LGBTQ plus community who would have been able finally to see something of themselves in these texts, rather than to feel that they are rejected and shut out and exiled from biblical tradition altogether, right? Do we need to be thinking in those terms? I will be the first to tell you that most of the time, the biblical authors seem to be operating in ways that seem highly binary, highly heteronormative to me. It's a thing around which you've heard me get very critical, right? How binary this is. To what extent we have here biblical hegemonic masculinity ruling the roost in the same way that we have it ruling our own, right? And the results for all oppressed, suppressed minority groups, including women and LGBTQ plus peoples. And I also think that white fire, black fire, that place of looking inside the text for other potential readings, whether or not the biblical author meant it that way, is worth our while, because it opens up discussion, it opens up possibility, and it opens up our minds, and it opens up our hearts to different ways of working and operating and living and moving in a very difficult world, particularly now, where the amount of legal assault on transgender individuals, on LGBTQ plus communities is absolutely through the roof. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And so when I see Erwin, who, by the way, was a former student of mine at the seminary, write something like this, and I want to also say, I want to give him an acknowledgement, because it was Erwin's essay on this topic that made me feel it's time to bring this material to you. I read it about a year ago, and I thought, oh, when John and I were talking about next year's plans, I thought, Erwin, you've just done it for me, right? So I want to acknowledge that his essay was so important and pivotal for me too. Like the work of Darren Guest, Erwin and other scholars and rabbis are making efforts to unpack these texts in ways that can liberate us from the constraints and the straitjackets of a heteronormative view of Bible. Okay, I hope we have time for questions.
Do you think Potiphar's wife was queer?
Was Potiphar's wife queer?
Well, she was very attractive.
She was very attracted to Joseph. Is there, I hadn't thought that one through, but boy, what a wonderful, I'm writing Erwin now. After today, I'm going home, I'm saying, Erwin, here's a question I got. And I also think that one of the things that I had worked on developing that I'm so very, very glad that Anne brought forward, this is what is the role of the father in all of this, right? I think I'm going to say, look, not only me, but there was somebody else in the community asking this question. Erwin, run with it, right? Let's see what he does. I think there's a chance that we could read it that way. And a very anxious Potiphar who basically insists, don't touch my wife, because he does say that. And he refers to her, by the way, Potiphar, in that line, not as his wife, but as lechem, as bread. You can touch anything you want, he says to Joseph. Everything is under your control, but the thing that I eat, right? Sexual associations around food, he is referring to his wife there. Yes?
Well, to just make a comment, this is so woke. It's just Sanders would have said, but did Joseph have any children?
Yes.
He did.
Yes. With actually the Egyptian woman. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Benjamin's mother, was it Rachel?
Was Rachel, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Also Joseph's mother.
Please use this.
Right.
Because they
Yes.
can't hear you.
Nobody can hear. So the question was, did Joseph have children? Ephraim and Manasseh are his children. By Asenath, the Egyptian, basically princess, who also appears to have had a father named Potiphar. Don't ask. Yeah. Like, that could get confusing.
Okay, and the other question was, Benjamin's mother was Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Correct.
And he had nothing to do with the original kidnapping?
No, he was not present at the time of that. No, yeah. Okay, other questions? Yes, poor Governor DeSantis would be running screaming from the room at this point. But what a coward, right? Signs that nice legislation about the 6-week abortion ban and then won't talk about it. Sorry, okay.
So in the Hebrew scriptures, what word is used for compassion? Like, how is Elohim's compassion? What
Yes.
word is that?
Also, the word rechem and rachamim. I used to kid my bar and bat, my b'nai mitzvah students all the time that when they were singing a particular prayer that started Av harachamim, they were actually singing Father of the womb. Because of rachamim and God's compassion, right? That's coming from rechem. It's coming from the same word. So there is that association with God's rachamim, right? But that, for some reason, that never comes up in the book of Genesis. God's rachamim never comes up. It comes up in other texts. But yeah, they were already doing an interesting gender moment there with the deity. Why not? Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah. Wait till we get to next year's stuff with God when I talk to you about God's sexual life. Then they're going to say, then it'll be Pam, really, we need somebody else. This one is just too out there. How many people are feeling like they're going to go home having taken in something that they never thought of before? Because that's always my aim. So, all right, in that case, pass it on, right? Pass it on. Pass your questions on, your thoughts on, your curiosities on. Don't let it just sit in this room. Like, pass it on. Have a conversation with, others and see what they come up with. Because, like Anne, they might ask you, you might get a question about Potiphar's wife again, being queer.
This is not an academic question, but why do you think it's so difficult?
Here, please use this.
Yes, I know. It's so easy to forget that. Maybe I should be helping Pam. Nobody says a word until the microphone's in their hand.
Why do you think it's so difficult for people to accept that there is such a thing as transgender?
Well, I will say two things about that. First, that actually is related to hegemonic masculinity, first of all. We've had 2,000 years of ideas about rule and governance and social structure that have been determined by heterosexual cisgender men. Heterosexual cisgender men. Transgender individuals are an immediate threat to a vision in which heterosexual cisgender men control the systems of politics, society, and economy, when you're already working very hard also to make sure women are kept in their place, right? Basically, everybody else is a danger to that kind of system, and a transgendered individual is particularly frightening and upsetting because they don't land in a definable place for you. Binary ideas also have been dominant in Western civilization since the time of the Greeks, who really created this taxonomy. And by the way, we could have a whole conversation on how this has affected Christian-Jewish relations, because this taxonomy of one category is bad, one category is good, right? There is the carnal world, there is the spiritual world, there's the Christian world, there is the Jewish world. You see what I'm saying? These ways of separating the world into binary oppositional categories are part and parcel with the last 2,000 years of how Westerners think about the world. Not Native Americans, not maybe Southeast Asians, not East Asians, but it's certainly our world. Yeah. Yeah, it was a good question, and I like questions that aren't academic too. Anyone else? Thoughts? Comments?
Is that the world?
Hold on. I'm going to be Pam's helper here.
Is that the world of the ancient Jewish world?
Is the Jewish world binary? Oh. So I would say less binary than the Greek world is. Because there's this place for ambiguity that we keep finding on all sorts of levels in the biblical text. But what has been made out of that text by, I want to say, Jewish and very particularly Christian and Greek and Roman readings has been to look what the translators are doing, right? The biblical author is not making a difference between the beauty of Rachel and the beauty of Joseph, but the translators do. So I would say the major blame for really imposing the strictest kind of binary structure on texts that are a little more liquid in some respects than we might imagine, I'm going to lay at the feet particularly of Greek and Roman culture, which is not to say that there isn't absolutely a heavily cisgender, heterosexual, masculine, imposed rule and way of thinking that dominates these texts.
Homosexuality did not have.
Yes. Pam, I didn't get to it fast enough.
The Greeks did not have that negative a view of homosexuality. In fact, they thought the highest manner of love was the love of a man and a young boy.
Though I would not use the word homosexuality again.
But
yes, there is. There's also where sexuality and gender relations are concerned, the ancient world is not our modern world. That is in many ways true. And it's dicey and hard here to kind of think this one through, because what do children have to defend themselves? And if you are in a society in which children are usable for sexual purposes, then, some little trigger's going off in me that's saying, wait a minute, that's wrong for me now. Is it wrong for me then? Can I just excuse this on the basis, there's some systemic structural dominance patterns here that make me a little nervous. Let me put it that way. Yeah. Wow, we could just be doing this all day. Okay, but the next person who has a comment, and I hear you, yes, Pam is holding this very high. There you go.
Well, in that light, David and Jonathan surpassing the love of women.
Right. Oh, I write about that. I write about that. Now, I don't think that David is describing a homosexual relationship, but I do think that it's clear that Jonathan absolutely has stuff for David. David, I think, is just an egotist. Everybody loves David, and David loves nobody, right? But the reason that Jonathan's love surpasses the love of women has to do with how Jonathan has supported him, has helped make him king, has done everything he can to, make David succeed Saul. I think there's more of the, you gave me what I really wanted, then I'm sexually attracted to you. There's never a point at which David indicates that he actually loves Jonathan. David might be incapable of love, except for God, and even that love is weird. We can talk about that next year. Because I have a whole chapter on it in the next book. Yes. Okay. Any other You know, a lot of you have been nodding your heads. I don't know how much time we have, but if anybody has another comment, you're creating some very vibrant moments here. We're good? Oh, one more. Okay, so it looks like, what is the time that we have to stop? I don't actually know.
We've got 10 minutes.
Oh, we've got 10 minutes. Well, what are you being shy about then? Don't just let the same people, you know, like the rest of you.
I
Speak
had
up.
asked last week afterwards for you to talk a little bit about the concept of golem, because in
Oh.
2 books I've read, one was a female golem and the other was a male.
Yes.
And the whole concept, and where did that come from originally?
Yes, this is totally has nothing to do with Joseph and everything to do with Joseph. No, it really, it does. The golem is, first of all, the product of a legend of Europe, Ashkenazi Europe, that around, we think, 16th, 17th century, this legend emerges around the capacity for rabbi to create life out, you know, like God, sort of imito Deo, right? That you're going to, like, do what God did and create life out of earth as God does in Genesis 2, and that the intention is to create a life that is capable of defending Jews against their oppressors, which is a characteristic feature of medieval Europe, is that there is a lot of violence that is exercised against Jewish communities across all of Europe. The basis of the legend is, you know, you pull from biblical texts. There's a little psalm text that this word shows up once in this psalm text to describe a life form, right? And that text is used as kind of the basis along with this Genesis story, along with another story in Talmud about 2 rabbis who study the laws of creation in Sefer Yetzirah. And in Sefer Yetzirah, that's the book of creation. There are all sorts of mystical, like, formulas that are supposed to help these rabbis create living beings, and they create a calf for their Shabbos dinner. So all of these things are kind of pulled together in the legend, and then you create this being who is supposed to protect the local Jews or serve the local Jews in some way or another, and almost inevitably runs amok, just goes amok in one way or another. There are multiple books and re-renderings of this figure, and what is really, really interesting is if you Google golem and transgender, you will find a number of people in the transgender community who are attached to the Jewish transgender community, who are attached to this figure because it is not intrinsically necessarily male or female in its manifestation. It is a living being. It is often described as male, but as you have just noticed, it can be appropriated as a figure that is liminal, that is moving in between these spaces, as we have seen Joseph seems to be moving in between spaces. So the golem figure has actually become very important to the transgender community. And very recently, I was involved in a Beit Din, which is a council which was bringing somebody before us for conversion to Judaism, and the person before us was a transgender individual, and one of the things they showed us, because they happened to be an artist, was their work on the golem. So when you said that, I thought, oh wow, look at this all coming together at the same time. Very, very, very talented artist, yeah. Okay, so we have a microphone, we have a few more minutes, but, you know, raise your hand and reach for the microphone.
I have a general question.
Sure, Pam.
So we've been exposed to today and last week with this binary nature of interpretation, and that Hebrew scripture from the beginning, I'm guessing, was more liminal, was far less definitive. When did you first start seeing this, and are you seeing this repeatedly across your readings of Hebrew scripture?
A lot of times what I do see is a horrific amount of absolutely awful male dominant heterosexual systems, right? But I would say that this is the gift of Hebrew and biblical Hebrew is that all of these, especially narrative texts, are written in a way that is incredibly cryptic and doesn't necessarily give you answers in the way that, our modern day novels do, right? Just they walked on together. They were a unity. That's the Hebrew of when Abraham walks with Isaac up to Mount Moriah. They walked together a unity, a yachad, right? Okay, what does that mean for what Abraham knows and what Isaac might suspect? You see how that you could unpack that? Right? But it's so cryptic. Nobody says Isaac is feeling scared and Abraham is feeling upset. The text doesn't do that. So the actual Hebrew texts, this is why I love them so much, is that they just force me all the time not to go to the predictable outcome because they won't allow me to. Even when they are showing me horrific, awful, evidence of the dominance of very profound male structures, there's still these moments, these spaces. I think it's the nature of the text. And actually, I don't want to claim, please, let's not do this, Jews and Hebrew, that's the greatest. Because honestly, you'll find this kind of cryptic language in a lot of ancient Near Eastern poetry, right? And a lot of sagas. The Gilgamesh story is similarly so. The Atrahasis narrative, the flood story of ancient Babylonia and the earlier version of Sumer, people were just writing in ways that were so almost more like poetry than like prose. And as you know, poetry just, invites you to ask questions. Read a poem today, and you'll see what I mean. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Greta.